Welcome to Your Daily Writing Habit. If you are writing a book or thinking about it, or maybe you've started writing your book, but you need some help getting it done, you are in the right place. Good morning, everyone. I'm your host, Christine Whitmarsh. If you're looking for me online, look for Christine Inc., like that stuff we write with. Each day, I'm sharing with you the writing habits I've learned over my 19 years as a ghostwriter, book coach, and author. I have found that three things in particular have a huge impact on your success as an author, and they can even help someone who doesn't particularly see themselves as an author become one. And those three things are writing fundamentals, productivity, and mindset habits. And once again, good morning, everyone. And we have a special Writer Wednesday episode of the show today. I am so excited to introduce my guest today, possibly even more excited than usual, which is saying a lot because you guys know I'm pretty excited as a person anyway, because I came across and I read this author's memoir a few years ago and I loved it. It's actually been one of my favorite books of recent years. So when she reached out about being a guest here on the show, I was just psyched. My guest today is Patricia Chadwick, author of the memoir, Little Sister. And let me tell you about Patricia. Patricia Chadwick is founder and president of Ravengate Partners, LLC, a consulting firm dedicated to providing businesses and not-for-profit organizations with education and advice about the financial markets and the global economy. Before founding Ravengate Partners, she had a 30-year career in the world of finance, culminating as a global partner at Invesco. Today, she sits on the board of directors of WEC Energies and Amica Mutual Insurance Company, as well as the mutual fund boards of Voya and the Royce Funds. In addition, she engages as an expert witness for cases involving investment management. Patricia dedicates much of her free time to not-for-profit causes. She mentors middle school girls at Our Lady Queen of Angels School in East Harlem. She is the pro bono chief administrative officer of Anchor Health Initiative, an organization she co-founded in 2016 that provides primary and specialty care for the LGBTQ community in Connecticut. She is a trustee and the treasurer of the Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut, and sits on a number of other not-for-profit boards, including Partnership Schools in New York, the United Theater, Westerly, Rhode Island, chair of the advisory board of Love School of Business, Elon University, advisory board of Metropolitan College at Boston University. Ms. Chadwick was graduated summa cum laude from Boston University with a BA in economics and is a chartered financial analyst. She lives with her husband in Greenwich, Connecticut. They have 2 children. Welcome, Patricia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
That is such an impressive background. And I already want to improvise a question before we even get started here. Can you just tell me, I want to hear the overview of your story and your incredible memoir, but can you tell me about the transition that you made from the world of investment and finance to the world of being an author? That immediately struck me as I was reading your impressive resume.
Oh, well, that's quite interesting. When one of the things that happened to me being in the world of finance was I ended up having my children when I was a bit older. I was actually 45 years old when I gave birth to my twins. And somewhere around that time, I said to myself, and this is something that women have to think about in their careers, as well as men, but I think it more falls on the shoulders of women. Okay, am I going to stop climbing the corporate ladder and be willing to split my time more with my family, which is very much what I wanted to do. And that was all fine for a while until about 4 or 5 years later. My children were, therefore, 4 or 5 years old. And I found myself suddenly back in that 15, 16-day working routine. And it was on a weekend, I actually wrote about this in my book, when I was with my husband and our 2 children up at the beach. And he said to me, you know, this isn't a vacation for you. You're working the whole time you're here. And I remember thinking about it that night, and I woke up the next morning and I said to him, guess what? It was Labor Day weekend. I said, guess what? On Tuesday, when I go back into the office, I'm going to quit. And truth be told, I had no idea what I was going to do. At the time, I was doing a lot of work on television, you know, on the financial side, you know, Squawk Box and CNN and things like that. And I I decided I would continue to do that because I was conversant on issues of the market and all. But I knew I wanted to spend more time with the children, and they were about to go into first grade. So I continued on going and sometimes getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to be on a 5:30 show and things like that. And one day a woman called me and she said, I've watched you on television and you do a great job. Have you ever thought of becoming an expert witness? I barely knew what an expert witness was. And so I said I'd be interested. And it was a kind of thing you could do all the work at home. And from there, I got another call. You know, we're interested in having you come on our board and things like that. And little by little, over the course of about half a dozen years, I created a second career, which was absolutely, you know, fascinating and has been wonderful. And I'm still involved in that career. But now I do so many pro bono things as well. So I have had a second career, and it wasn't until I was 60, so by then my children were well into their teenagedom, that I started writing my book. And I think perhaps I wish you had been around, because it took me 10 years to write my book. And you may ask me some questions about that, but it was a 10-year, not ordeal, but it was a 10-year process.
And I love that rewording right there, instead of ordeal, process, because it is a process. And that's something I talk about, my listeners know here on the show. And that's why we need good habits to help us through that process. And that's not unusual. I think, you know, a lot of people take so long to write their book. What I'm so inspired by is age 60, because there are so many people, I don't know, people have like age time limits in their head about when it's too old to do blank. And I read a story, I think, about a 97-year-old gentleman who I think he became literate when he was 90, and he published his first book when he was 97. So there's no age limits on anything.
Fantastic. That's
You're way ahead of him.
Story.
So for those who haven't read your amazing memoir, Little Sister, could you give us an overview of the central story of the book?
Sure. I love the prologue, which is a very short prologue, but it's I'll just kind of pick it from memory. At the time when I was 18 years old, I had never been in a restaurant. I'd never been in a grocery store. I'd never seen a movie. I had never owned a single thing that was my own. I had never danced. I was never seen a television, never listened to the radio. And I was about as far removed from what one would have considered to be normal all-American existence. And this was in the state of Massachusetts. Some people might have thought if I said I was coming from North Dakota, I'm sorry, North Dakotans, I don't mean to insult you, or Idaho or someplace like that, they'd go, okay, there are some of those weird things that happen out there. But truth be told, this was a community that I was born into, and there were 60 grown-ups, and ultimately there were 39 children who were born into it. I was one of the oldest children, and it was a religious community that started off in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And my parents were part of it. They were staunchly Catholic, and it was built around the idea that you had to be Catholic to get to heaven. And if we look at other religions, there are plenty of religions that we know that think the same way. One doesn't tend to think of it quite so much with the Catholic religion. But long story short, by holding that very doctrinaire point of view, this little organization fell out of good favor with the Boston Diocese and ultimately with Rome. And Father Feeney, who was the spiritual leader, was excommunicated. And my father, who was a professor at Boston College, was fired, along with 2 other professors. And pretty soon, I was very, very tiny when that happened. But over the next couple of years, this community of people turned into a religious order. And there were married couples and single people, and the married couples continued having children. And then the decision was made by the priest that ran it and by the woman who was his spiritual cohort, she was actually a married woman herself, that they made all the rules. Everybody agreed to obey them. And pretty soon the children were taken away from the parents, and then the parents were forced into vows of celibacy. And along around the time I was 9 years old, we left Cambridge and moved to a town about 30 miles west of Boston, which was called Harvard, Massachusetts. Beautiful, bucolic environment. And it was then that we became practically monastic in our upbringing. I wasn't allowed to speak to my parents, and I had 4 younger siblings. And the rules and the discipline were, in some ways, grotesque. And we were being groomed all to be, as young children, to ultimately be the bride of Christ. And I could see by the time I was 12 or 13 that this was the path, which was the last thing I wanted in my life. I did not want to be a member of a religious order, but this was the only thing I knew, and it was the only home I had. And then along around the time I was a teenager, 12, 13, 14, I started to have a crush on different men in the organization. And I didn't really have any crushes on the boys because all of them were really younger than I was. So my crushes ended up, they were the most innocent in the world. I knew nothing about why a crush even happened. But long story short, by then we were educated within our community. And when I was a senior in high school, Sister Catherine, the woman that ran the place, basically called me into her office and told me she was kicking me out. And that was it. I was gone. And the book goes into much greater detail, but my parents remained there, my siblings remained there, and I was out in the world on my own.
So amazing. And that was an interesting point you brought up, no offense to people in North Dakota or Idaho or any of those, but I think, just going by cliches, people would think, somewhere maybe like, less educated, townships or something like that. We're talking about Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University, and then around there you have Emerson, Boston College, Boston University. I know I grew up outside of Worcester, Massachusetts. So this is not to be snobby about New England, but that's not the kind of story that you associate with something that's happening literally like around the corner from Harvard University.
And a lot of these people had PhDs and master's degrees, and they came from Spain and Lebanon and Italy, and all parts of the United States. Some of them were, came from very well-to-do families. It was just an amazing mixture. But they were my uncles and aunts, and nearly everyone has died now. But they are still my family. Interestingly.
So interesting. So, when you did finally decide to write your book, I'm sure there were people telling you for years, "Oh my goodness, Patricia, you need to write a book about that." Probably for many years. What made you finally decide to pull the trigger, whether it was like emotionally or personally or psychologically? What were the reasons where you finally decided, yes, I need to do this. I need to not wait a moment longer?
Well, the thing that may surprise you and your listeners is that, truth be told, I told literally no one about my life story. I didn't know how to tell it. And particularly when I first came out, I didn't want anyone to know where I came from, because in Boston, to be called a Feeneyite was really to be kicked in the gutter for all intents and purposes. So I didn't want anyone to know. And once I started getting my career together, I realized I didn't have to go there, because you know how if you say to someone, "Well, where did you grow up?" And they say, "Cleveland, Ohio." "Oh, great. I have an aunt that lives there." "And where did you go to school?" But if I started to tell my story, it wouldn't be a 3-minute story. It would be a 300-minute story. So it was on my 55th birthday. I was with both my parents, and we were sitting on the porch looking out over the ocean. And I said to them, "I've been thinking about writing the stories of my childhood." And I said, "I actually look back on my childhood with a lot of pleasure." And I said, 50 years from now, there will be no more eyewitnesses to what happened. And both of them were hugely supportive. I knew I could only write my story. And while there were 39 children, and honestly, at least 2/3 of them have come to me since I wrote the book and said, thank you for writing the book. But I didn't try to tell anyone's story but my own. Now, 85% of our stories overlapped, but then important elements of everyone's story was different. My one sister, Kathy, does come up a lot in the book because I kind of protected her. And she was totally fine with my telling those stories. But I also realized that I had to learn the craft of writing. I had a career on Wall Street where you write simple declarative sentences that are really all about pointing you in the direction of, are you buying this stock? What should you be doing for, whatever the issue is, all about finance. There was nothing about creative writing. And I had never been engaged in creative writing. And a friend of mine suggested that I attend a writing workshop. And I did that once or twice a week for 4 or 5 years. And I was in a small group of women with a leader who was a writer. And each week we would bring about 1,000 words. And I started telling my story. And the women that were in the group were just so encouraging. And I said, well, I've been so fearful about writing this because I adore my parents and I'm afraid people will hate them. And they were wonderful and supportive. And they said, we don't hate your parents. We know whom we hate. And so that was important. And even now when I read my book, I'll go to myself, oh, Patricia, why did you use that word? You could have used another word. So I'm always correcting myself. But truth be told, once I finished my book, I was addicted to writing. And I was thinking, well, I don't have another book to write. Why don't I become a ghostwriter? And I kept thinking of different people who write. And then I thought, but how do you tell someone's story that's not your own? How do you get inside that head, inside the emotions? And then someone said, but you've got to write a story. You did so well on Wall Street and you didn't, I wasn't sent off to college. I had to educate myself. I mean, I had a classic, brilliant high school education, and I had been accepted at Vassar and at Bates where my father had gone. But that's all for people who want to read the book to find out why those didn't materialize. And so I then said, okay, I am going to write the story. And I'm a little bit, the way I was brought up in very Catholic fashion is you don't really talk about yourself. So this idea of talking about myself, I've had to get used to. But I am writing it, and I am appreciative to listen to you talk about productivity, writing fundamentals, and mindset habits. And I want to hear some advice from you because there are challenges on the second book as well as my first book.
I'm honored to hear that. And there's so many things. Before I go into try to do an overview of all my advice on productivity habits, that would be fun. My listeners are probably laughing, but there were so many interesting things that you just said that I wanted to pull out because they're kind of, themes of things that I've talked about on the show. Like you talked about how when you were approaching your memoir, you didn't try to write the story of all the Feeneyites, of everything that happened. You wrote your point of view. And that's something I'm always talking to my kind of tribe of authors about, where don't confuse a memoir with a biography. A biography is the first we did this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and it's heavily researched. A memoir is I consider it like a slice of the pie or a specific camera angle. It's your specific camera angle on what may be a much larger story. So I just wanted to call that out to my listeners. And also, you did, for someone who's asking me about a writing habit, by taking that writing workshop with that author leader and committing to writing 1,000 words a week, that was establishing a writing habit. And that's the first step. It's finding some sort of trigger, some sort of reason. I know a lot of my listeners use this as kind of their daily trigger for their writing habit, whether it's daily or a few times a week or weekly. It's, creating that kind of, there's a habits thing that I read in my favorite book on habits, by the way, if this helps you, Patricia, is Atomic Habits by James Clear. Fantastic book on habits. And he talks about where, the first step in establishing, like if you want to run 5 miles a day, you don't try to just go out and run 5 miles a day. He said the very first step is, what's the trigger? You put the sneakers, your sneakers next to the front door before you go to bed the night before. So you find that little thing. So you signing up for that writing workshop, that was the beginning of your writing habit. So it's finding those specific triggers. And another kind of drum that I'm beating all the time that hopefully helps you is most likely it will only happen if it's scheduled on your calendar. So you schedule your writing time. You probably realized this while you were writing Little Sister, is if it's scheduled on your calendar, it will most likely happen. So I have a lot of authors that, looking for the extra time, the spare time to write a book. And let me know, you can tell me from your experiences writing Little Sister, how much spare time and extra time popped up in your schedule to write this book?
Well, it was my first book, but I'm finding the same with my second book. There are times when the kinetic energy inside me won't let me stop writing. And there are other times when there's a kind of boulder in front of me that makes it really hard for me to connect the words with what I want to express. Now, that was a little more on the emotional side in my first book. And in my first book, I found myself not wanting to tell the really unsavory and seriously unpleasant parts. And some of them I didn't get around to telling till I was two-thirds of the way through the book. And I realized that my book was genuine. And I said to myself, if you don't tell those parts, your book is a lie, because you're not telling the whole story. So once I got over that threshold, I went, then write it. Now, you've read my book, and so there's a very ugly Me Too story in the book. I did not plan to put that in, and I was talking to my agent, and the book was ready to go to print for all intents and purposes. And I think he was looking for some juicy bits, and I was quite guarded on my own, relative, then I'll be a little less guarded in my second book. I feel more comfortable now. But I said, all right, I am going to tell you a story. And I told him the story that's in the book. And this was in early 2017 when he and I met. And the Harvey Weinstein issues all came out that following 10 months later in October, I think it was, of that year. I told him this story. He was really sweet. He was very horrified. And he said, here's my advice. Write it down if you can. And then if you want to take it out of the book, we will take it out. And in that particular case, unlike much of the other book, wild as it is, in that particular case, writing that story was truly cathartic. Once I saw it on the piece of paper and read it back to myself, I said, it's okay. I will leave it out there. Now, it doesn't mean that I still sometimes don't feel some kind of angst at the notion that people, hundreds, thousands of people will read this, and many of them know me, and they will see me in a different light as someone who has gone through this experience. But truth be told, I thought I was 1 in 5 million. And it was only after the Harvey Weinstein stuff came out and all of those other stories that we now hear that I realized maybe I was 1 in 5. And so I feel a much greater camaraderie with so many people who have gone through the same and worse. So it was wonderful to have written it, and good for me and good for the audience, because I think for them to hear a story like that, many of them have perhaps been in a similar situation, and it can help them say, oh my gosh, maybe you can get over that. And I had no choice. I had to work, and I knew that if I turned that guy in, he was the big producer, as I said, and I was the girl in the miniskirts. But it's not always easy, even now, for me to write my own story. If I were writing fiction, I think it would be easier for me. I don't think I'd be a good fiction writer at all. I know truth is stranger than fiction, I admire people who can wend a crazy, wild story. I feel as though I only know how to tell my own, but I still get blockages. But lately it's been going really well, and I keep trying to like find time at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock to come back to my office and keep writing.
So much great stuff there. And believe it or not, what you just said, there are actually, I have authors who do this where if their subject matter for whatever reason is so sensitive, is more like in the realm of like potential lawsuit sensitive, they will actually turn their memoirs into novels and they will write it as fiction. I have authors that do that. So that's definitely been done. And you were saying something else that was so interesting to me. Yeah, just really the advice that you got from your agent, write it down, because I mean, this is something that I talk about all the time with memoirs, is it is such a cathartic therapeutic process. And I finally published my own memoir last summer after doing this for 20 years. So I finally got to walk in my client's shoes, and there were some surprises where I was like, oh, is that why they say these things to me? Okay, now I understand their memoir writing pain. So
Right.
it is, yeah, it's very therapeutic, very cathartic, but that's such a great actionable piece of advice that you gave where, for those of my listeners who are writing their memoirs, or even I consider a memoir, there's a memoir aspect to most nonfiction books out there and some fiction books these days, because really, how interesting is a business book without any element of the author's personal story? So I believe there's memoir elements everywhere, but if something is, sensitive or like, I don't know. Well, first of all, if you're on the fence about sharing it, there's probably someone who needs to hear it. Like you're saying, all the people out there that, 1 in 5, there's so many people that need to hear that subject matter. And if you're still on the fence, yeah, write it down and then see how you feel about it, but don't just keep it inside and assume that you should censor it. So that was a great piece of advice.
One other thing that I found myself doing, because I'm blessed with an extraordinarily good memory, but to check myself, I Google things all the time. For instance, I knew there was an event that took place on March 25th, 1960. I knew it because it was the Feast of the Annunciation, and it was a holy day of obligation, which meant we didn't have school. But I wanted to make sure, and so I just Googled March 25th, 1960. Was a Friday. Sure enough, it came back as a Friday. I went, God, I know I've got my date right. And you can do that so many different ways. If you're just not sure exactly about something, you can look up. I remember the Bay of Pigs was something that I came to learn about. And I wanted to remember exactly when it was. You can look those things up, and then you can incorporate it into, what was going on at the time or whatever. So doing research really helps you. And in my case, I would share a lot of experiences with my sisters as I was writing, and they would go, well, don't you remember the time we did this? And it would click, and it was a light bulb, and it was as though I had other researchers working with me. And even now on my book the title is Breaking Glass, and it's my story of quotes, growing up on Wall Street, because my first job on Wall Street was as the receptionist. And, but there are so many people I've known and continue to know. And my closest girlfriend, she and I have talked about things, and we've laughed so hard about them, but she's brought so much back into my memory. So if you're writing about your memoir and you're not doing it totally secretively, it's good to reach out to people, because their experience will enlighten your memory about things. You may not remember the particular incident, but it will lead you to another one. You go, oh my gosh, that time I was picking apples, and all those kinds of experiences. So I didn't tell many people. I think I was saying to you before I wrote my book, the only people I had ever told my story to were my husband, were a man that I had been with before him, and my closest girlfriend. Now, outside of that, of course, people knew, because I was still very friendly up there, and I would go and visit, and people that would visit would know that I had grown up there. And the townsfolk knew I had grown up there. But nobody in my professional life, not even my closest girlfriend with whom I moved to Philadelphia, knew the story. She said, I can't believe this story. I knew you for 40 years, and I never knew this story.
That's the beauty and brilliance of a memoir, and I like that. You're reminding me for my own memoir, because my memoir is about as a whole scoliosis, back surgery, dying on the operating table, coming back to life kind of story. But I interviewed my mom for her recollections, because obviously there's a huge gap where I wasn't really there. Like, there was 15 hours on the operating table, and then I think I was in the ICU for a week after. So I really needed her recollections of what the heck was going on during that time. So that's such a valuable tool to get insights from others too. I mean, that wasn't like she was going to trigger anything in my mind because I wasn't there, really,
Exactly.
but she certainly was able to fill in some blanks.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So let's compare what kind of response were you honestly expecting to your book before it was published? And if you can compare that to the response that your book actually received, and how you felt about that.
That's a great question. I had been in my Christmas cards that I hand send out every year to about 500 or 600 people. And I'm still doing that. I have been writing for several years, still working on my memoir. And then finally one year I said, my book is coming out in the spring. So that got a lot of people interested. And then, I have an array of friends. As I say, once in my Rolodex, never out of it. And so I have friends that go back. I called old boyfriends from 50 years ago saying, I've just come out with a book and I don't, and just that kind of thing. I remember one in particular, this wonderful woman, she's 85 years old. And I had sent, with my Christmas card that year, I had sent out a little card inside it that basically gave that little outline that I gave at the front, that we talked about, the prologue, just foreshortened. And I then was down in Florida visiting this elderly woman. And the moment she saw it to me, she said, now you and I, my dear, need to sit down and have a conversation. She said, and she was such a proper but enormously funny lady, wicked sense of humor. And so there was, it was just like sheer shock and awe kind of thing, because here I looked like a very together person. Maybe I'm not together at all. I'd had a career. I pleasantly social animal. I enjoy people. I enjoy having dinners and lunches and putting people together and, seeing children and cousins and everything. And it's just like, and we've never heard an experience like this, like, how did you survive, et cetera, et cetera. So I was very, very, very nervous, I have to admit. But once I had committed, I knew it had to happen. So I just wanted the date to come. I had a little pub party in New York, which was unbelievably fun. And people were so supportive and wonderful. And my publisher was there and my agent was there. And after that, it became easier. And then there were these 39 children that I grew up with. And I was very, very anxious that they not be upset. But I knew I had to tell my own story. Sadly, some of those children have already died, but of those that are still alive, at least 2/3 of them came to me and said, thank you for writing the book. And it has built up some relationships that had maybe kind of floated away, because for a lot of people, there's a lot of anxiety about going back to their home. And they feel, one of them said, I feel a weight off my shoulder. The world now knows, and it needed to know. And yet she said, I could never have written it. It was too tortuous for me to write. I feel like a very lucky person. Not that we're talking about my book per se. I feel as though I was born with a resilient gene. And I am an optimist, such an optimist, that, I could be buried up to my neck in sand and I'd go, there's somewhere out of here. I don't know what it is, but we'll figure it out. So I think that it's when it's hard to share things, that's probably a very good sign. but then you have to write it in a way, you know, you read my book. I'm not a victim in my book.
Yeah.
And it's very important, I think, when you write a book, to have the power to make the story one that doesn't make somebody want to go out and cry or stab someone or whatever, because it's your personality that has to come through. And that, I mean, looking at you told me your story. I mean, I cannot fathom being so physically wrecked, as it were. And to see you today, and you know, you look unbelievably healthy. You're cheerful, and sometimes the pains that one goes through are the soil from which, you know, better things sprout up. And I like to think that we all have the ability to overcome whatever hardships we have. Not everybody can. And when I was younger, I used to think everybody could bootstrap themselves. And I think one of the reasons I work in some of the ways I do, mentoring middle school girls and working in a healthcare, you know, creating a healthcare facility for the LGBTQ community, is because they can't always. And it's important. You know, I now I write a lot. I write articles for newspapers and things like that. And I see a side that's not always the Wall Street side. It's the other street. It's the Main Street side and what people go through. And so just part of living is making me a better writer, I think.
I think so. And first of all, thank you. And second, you kind of identified why I do what I do for a living, why I love helping people write memoirs, because not everybody is strong enough to, like you said, bootstrap themselves and go on and live to see another day. But people who have the courage to do that, who, you know, have the courage to share their stories like you have in your memoir, we can help those people. We can help kind of, I guess, bootstrap them and carry them along. So if they don't have the power internally, this is the power of a memoir. This is the power of a book, that we can kind of like reach into the darkness and reach for their hand and say, you know, I've been through the thing that you're going through. Here's what I learned. Come with me out of the darkness. So that's why I do what I do.
Well, it's a godsend to people. It's wonderful.
That's awesome. So I want to talk about, because you touched a little bit on how you let people know about your book before it was coming out, because I've been having a conversation with one of my author groups recently about the dreaded M word, marketing. There's a lot of authors that just don't really like that idea. And one of the ways, the reason, I don't know if you know this, that you got my attention, that I even knew about your book in the first place when it came out, and actually I knew about it before it came out, is I don't even remember how, I was following you on Instagram, and I was just really impressed with how authentically you talked about your book. And that's why I ended up buying a copy. I was one of your Instagram followers. I saw you talking about it. I was fascinated by the story you were telling me. I said, I don't know who this person is, but I need to read this book. So you don't seem to have like if I'm understanding correctly, you don't seem to have a massive aversion to marketing, and it seems yours is very much just, intimate and one-on-one, and you're just kind of like talking to your readers. But kind of tell me your thoughts and your relationship with the idea of marketing and how you approach that.
Well, if left to my own devices, I wouldn't be a good marketer. And in fact, it's very funny. So I majored in economics in college, and I've often wondered why anybody would ever, invest the time and energy to study marketing. It's just like marketing, what? You're not really doing anything if you're marketing. So that's how pathetic I am when it comes to marketing. That being said, it does take an awful lot of personal endeavor. And there were two ways for me to do it. One, I have agreed to be on almost every blog or, podcast, book group. I have done so many book events. And now that we all have Zoom and coronavirus has made it easy for us to be with each other, it's all able to be done from home, and it works wonderfully. I'm doing another one, even though my book's been out now 2 years, I'm doing another one with a group of 80-something-year-old ladies in Houston. And they've all read the book. So I am so excited because the questions are just going to come pouring out. But because I also have a very full-time job and I work on boards and all, I actually, in my case, decided it was best to get someone who knew better than I how to do it. And so I have a social media person, and she is brilliant. She makes me do work. She says, okay, I'd like some pictures. You know, it was Women's Day the other day. You know me, I forgot completely, had no idea. But she went through my photos and pulled together this wonderful array of pictures. But it was my anniversary yesterday, my 36th anniversary. And so I sent her a bunch of pictures, and then I wrote the script for it. So it does take time. She's my nudge. She tells me, I want you to do this. And I say, yes, mother, because I know it's needed. And I'm willing and I need to have someone direct me. And I bet there's a business out there where, you know, some people can do part of it themselves and they need someone else to help them with the rest. And I think that's just human nature. We're not all good at everything. And so in this case, I have basically said, you know, you tell me what you want from me. You tell me. I mean, I'll now see pictures of a cardinal at the bird feeder. And I'll make up a story because the cardinals are all chirping away like mad now. It's mating season. And then, you know, a deer was trying to eat out of my bird feeder the other day. So I wrote a little, dear Mrs. Doe, you've got the grass. Why don't you let the bird chickadees and the things do? And I send them off to her and she populates them around. But it does, you have to think all the time in that mode. And it's not my instinct to do so. But, you know, I'm learning. And even at 72, it's not too late to learn.
It never is, as we talked about offline before. And some such great points there, because even, you know, the marketing needs to be done as an author. There's no option of not doing it, because there's like millions of books on Amazon. They're not going to find your book magically unless you're talking about it. And in your situation, it's so great because, yeah, you have the nudge and you have the person that's doing the technical piece. But as I could always tell from the beginning on your Instagram, I could tell it was, even without knowing you, I could just tell it was your authentic voice because it sounded like a real person. And I wished you a happy anniversary on your Instagram yesterday, actually. So I can always tell that it's your authentic voice and you have a person that's facilitating. I know this because I actually facilitate social media for one of my well-known clients. So, and I'm always nudging for the photos and everything like that. But it's so important, no matter how you do marketing, and, you know, it is important, all you authors, you need to do it somehow, whether you need to have someone completely take it over for you. And then if in that case, make absolutely certain that your voice is still in there, or maybe it's just a nudge where it's like you produce the content and the person posts it, but it's finding the relationship that works for you and your time and your abilities, but your voice needs to still be in there. And I think that's what a lot of my authors wrestle with, where it's just like, well, what do I say? And how do I talk to my readers? And, you know, figuring that out, like figuring out who your readers are and how to tell your story to them and connect with them. That's why I always say marketing is just, it's a fancy way of saying having a conversation with your readers. They call it like marketing, like it's Pepsi and Coca-Cola or whatever, but it's just a really fancy way of saying talking to your readers. So I like to break it down to my listeners and the authors who follow me and say, all right, are you okay with like just talking, just having a conversation with your books and about yourself to your readers? That's marketing. So I'm glad that you kind of shared that about how it's a collaboration with you and
Yes.
that the nudge works.
Yeah, and the nudge works. It's great. I love being nudged by her. And she sits on the West Coast and she's just amazing. I can send her something at 6 a.m. and she gets right back to me. I said, I'm so sorry if I woke you. She said, oh, don't worry. No. She's like a 24-hour butterfly. She's just amazing.
She's impressive.
Yes,
I don't know. I'm not that impressive.
I bet you are.
Time-wise. But it gets done. So you had mentioned the book that's a really cool title, the book that you're working on now. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we wrap it up about your upcoming book? And is there a timeline for it or anything else you'd like to share about that?
Well, you know, if I pay attention to you with productivity and writing a certain amount each day, my hope, and it's very dangerous to tell a large audience that my hope is to have the document completed late spring, early summer. Mm-hmm. And my publisher would like to publish it next spring, which would be 3 years from the time my first book came out. So I think that's a good time. It's breaking glass, which is a nice way of saying that there doesn't have to be a glass ceiling. But it's a real journey, and it was a journey that started off, where I did not know where I was going to go. All I knew is I was all alone in the world. I didn't understand the language of people. I'd never heard a swear word or even any kind of, word that was not totally proper English. And this language, I didn't know who baseball players were or basketball players. And I had to enter the world and not pretend I was, and pretend I wasn't an idiot, which I wasn't an idiot per se, but I was an idiot in the world that I was in. And so it was, I had to be with closed mouth, big ears, big eyes, till I could tiptoe into that world. And then it became my drive was to get the education that I had so wanted. And I did. But I started at the very bottom of the ladder and never said, oh, I intend to go blank. Doors kept opening, and sometimes doors got shut in my face. And when a door is shut in your face, you go around the outside of the building and you find another way to keep on going. And the energy and the excitement of success just bred more and more. And I moved from Boston to Philadelphia and back to Boston and then to New York. And once I got to New York, I was like, okay, this is my place. Granted, it's the center of the financial world. And I was a tough task mistress in a way. And it was not always easy because I was hard on myself, which meant I was also hard on other people, even though I didn't see it that way. But it's a fun story. There are crazy things. Wall Street's a crazy story, but it's not, of course, the people are going to put the make on you in 1,000 different ways, but I always felt very much in control. Nobody ever, outside of the situation when I was all of 21 years old, no one was going to, get in my way, in my space if I didn't want it. And so I did have a couple of monikers that are pretty tough, and I will put them in the book. I think they're funny today. They're rather shocking back there, but it's a very open and fun, and I think a story that I hope will be helpful to people who think, oh, how can I really get somewhere? Sometimes you have to take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes you have to plateau for a while. Sometimes, you need both luck and pluck. Those are 2 things. And if in life, you're going to get luck. Nobody has no good luck, but you do on your own. When luck is not around, you have to use your own pluck. And I think that's part of the message of the book, and I hope it will be fun.
That is great advice. And yeah, excited to hear about that. Yeah. And if the show can be useful, I was telling you before, 5 minutes a day motivates you to do something.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I'll be running down the other end of the house. It's like, where are you going? Oh, I just got motivated.
That's funny. So Patricia, what is the best way for people to connect with you and learn more about you and your books and anything else you have going on?
Sure. I have a website, which is very simple, patriciachadwick.com. Yeah. It has lots and lots of interviews. I actually write a number of columns and blogs. So those are there, a whole array of subjects, sometimes funny, sometimes I'm actually writing one about the minimum wage right now, which is a very hot topic, and that will be out in a few days. But I think that's the best way. My Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn are all there. Those get populated on a pretty regular basis. But patriciachadwick.com, I have a wonderful interview by CBS last November that sent my book for maybe 1 hour, I don't know, to #1 on Amazon.
Oh my goodness. Excellent.
But it was there. I flashed it. I took a picture, and the next day it wasn't there. So, they calculate by the hour.
Yep.
But I've had some wonderful articles and things like that too. So,
Well, that's excellent. I'll make sure I'll put a link in the show notes today to Patricia's website so everybody can visit her very easily. And thank you again so much for being on the show today, Patricia. This has just been, it's been an honor and it's been a joy. And yeah, two New England girls talking about books.
Thank you, Christine.
Yeah.
I've really loved it.
Great. And thank you, all of you, as always, for joining me here on Your Daily Writing Habit, where I am helping you write and finish writing an awesome book. And please drop by my Inc. Authors group on Facebook, and I'll, of course, drop the link in the show notes to connect with other authors like yourself for motivation, accountability, book publishing resources, and more. Until tomorrow, happy writing.